The excavator's steel teeth bit into concrete as Karen Martinez burst through the gate, her face twisted with rage. "Stop. That pool belongs to the community," she shrieked, waving legal documents that would shatter everything David thought he knew about his own backyard. What Karen didn't know was that David had already discovered her darkest secret, and this pool was just the beginning of her downfall. The morning sun cast long shadows across David Chen's backyard as the excavator rumbled to life, its diesel engine echoing off the neighboring houses. He stood on his back porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the massive machine position itself next to the kidney-shaped pool that had dominated his property for the past 15 years. "You're sure about this, Mr. Chen?" called out Mike Rodriguez, the demolition crew supervisor, his voice barely audible over the machinery. "It's a beautiful pool. Shame to see it go." David nodded firmly, his jaw set with determination. "I'm sure, tear it down." The pool had been nothing but a source of problems since his divorce 6 months ago. Sarah had wanted it in the settlement, but the judge had ruled that since it was built entirely on David's inherited property, it remained his. The maintenance costs were astronomical, and with his kids living with their mother in Seattle, it served no purpose except to remind him of happier times that felt like someone else's life. The excavator's arm swung down, and the hydraulic breaker attachment made contact with the pool's edge. The first chunk of concrete cracked and fell into the shallow end with a satisfying crash that David felt in his chest. David Chen." The shrill voice cut through the construction noise like a fire alarm. David turned to see Karen Martinez, marching toward him across his lawn, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her face flushed with indignation. She wore her usual uniform of yoga pants and an oversized designer sweater, but her typical suburban composure had cracked. "Karen." David's voice was flat, emotionless. He'd been expecting this. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen demanded, stopping just close enough to be confrontational but far enough to maintain her sense of superiority. "That pool is community property." David nearly choked on his coffee. "Community property? Karen, it's in my backyard, on my land, that I inherited from my grandmother. The homeowners association has easement rights." Karen pulled out her phone, frantically scrolling through documents. Section 47B of the Willowbrook Estates Covenant clearly states that recreational facilities installed after 1995 that enhance community property values are subject to community oversight. Mike had stopped the excavator and was watching the exchange with obvious amusement. The other workers gathered around, suddenly finding their work boots very interesting. "That's not how easements work, Karen," David said, his patience already wearing thin. "And even if it were, which it isn't, you'd need unanimous board approval to make any claim on private property." "I am the board." Karen's voice pitched higher, her face turning an alarming shade of red. "I'm the HOA president, secretary, and treasurer." "Yeah, about that." David set his coffee mug on the porch railing and pulled out his own phone. "Funny thing happened when I was researching property law for this pool demolition. I discovered some interesting financial discrepancies in our HOA records." Karen's expression shifted from rage to something closer to panic. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The new playground equipment fund, $15,000 raised from special assessments last year." David's voice remained calm, but his eyes were ice cold. "Equipment that was never purchased. Money that somehow disappeared from the HOA account. That money is in escrow, pending vendor negotiations," Karen stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Escrow account that doesn't exist, according to First National Bank?" David took a step closer. "But I did find a $15,000 home improvement loan in your name, taken out the same week the playground fund went missing. Interesting timing for your kitchen renovation, don't you think?" The color drained from Karen's face. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can." David held up his phone, showing a screenshot of bank records. "I used to be a forensic accountant. Before I went into software development, old habits die hard. I've already submitted my findings to the county attorney's office." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. The construction workers weren't even pretending to work anymore. They were watching the drama unfold with the intensity of a soap opera audience. "This isn't over," Karen hissed, backing away. "I'll sue you for defamation. I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood." "With what money?" David asked quietly. "Your legal defense fund is going to be pretty expensive. Embezzlement charges tend to require good lawyers." Karen turned and stalked back toward her house, but not before shouting over her shoulder, "That pool is staying. I'll get an injunction." David watched her go, then nodded to Mike. "Keep working. She has no legal standing to stop this." The excavator roared back to life, and chunks of concrete began flying again. David felt a weight lifting from his shoulders with each piece of his old life that crumbled away. The pool had to go not just because of the maintenance costs or the memories, but because it represented everything he was leaving behind. The pretentious neighborhood politics, the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, the toxic relationships that had poisoned his marriage. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "Injunction hearing set for tomorrow morning. Karen Martinez versus David Chen. Be ready." David smiled grimly. Karen had no idea what she was walking into. The pool was just the beginning. He'd been quietly documenting HOA violations and financial irregularities for months, building a case that would expose the entire corrupt system Karen had built around herself. By noon, half the pool was gone. David's neighbors had begun gathering along the property line, whispering among themselves. Some looked concerned, others excited. Everyone knew that Karen Martinez had finally met someone who wouldn't back down from her threats and intimidation. Mrs. Patterson from next door approached the fence cautiously. "David, dear, is everything all right? Karen was over here earlier, claiming the pool belongs to all of us somehow." "Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson. Karen's just upset that someone finally called her out on her illegal activities." The elderly woman's eyes widened. "Illegal activities, embezzlement, harassment, abuse of power. Take your pick." David's voice carried clearly across the yard, and he knew the neighborhood gossip network would spread the news faster than social media. As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors stopped by. Some offered support, others asked probing questions about the HOA finances. David answered honestly but carefully, letting them draw their own conclusions about Karen's behavior over the years. By 5 o'clock, the pool was completely gone, leaving only a gaping hole in the ground and a pile of broken concrete. David stood at the edge of the excavation, surveying the destruction with satisfaction. Tomorrow, he'd have clean-filled dirt brought in and grass seed planted. In 6 months, no one would ever know there had been a pool here. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his lawyer's number. "David, we have a problem," Attorney Williams said without preamble. "Karen Martinez didn't just file for an injunction. She's claiming that removing the pool damaged her property value and is seeking $1,000 in damages." $50,000. David laughed. "She's insane." "Maybe, but she's also represented by Blackstone, Kruger, and Associates. That's a serious law firm. Someone's backing her financially." David frowned. Karen's husband worked at a mid-level accounting firm. They lived comfortably but weren't wealthy enough to afford high-end legal representation. "Any idea who?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it. The hearing's at 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." After hanging up, David walked the perimeter of his property, checking for any damage that Karen might claim was caused by the pool removal. Everything looked normal except for some minor settlement cracks in his own driveway, which had been there for years. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, David noticed lights on in unusual numbers of houses. Curtains twitched as he passed windows. The entire street was buzzing with tension and anticipation. He was about to head inside when a black Mercedes sedan pulled up in front of Karen's house. A tall man in an expensive suit got out and walked to her front door. David didn't recognize him, but something about the man's bearing suggested serious money and power. 20 minutes later, the Mercedes left, and Karen's house went dark except for one upstairs window where David could see her silhouette pacing back and forth. Phone pressed to her ear. David's own phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Drop the embezzlement charges or you'll regret it." He screenshot the message and forwarded it to his lawyer with a note. "Looks like Karen found herself a benefactor. This just got interesting." As he locked his front door and settled in for the night, David reflected on the day's events. He'd expected Karen to be angry about the pool, but her extreme reaction suggested something deeper was at stake. The mysterious legal backing, the threats, the desperation in her voice, it all pointed to secrets that went far beyond a simple HOA power trip. The excavated hole in his backyard seemed to glow in the moonlight, a perfect metaphor for the foundations of lies. And the Riverside County Courthouse buzzed with unusual activity for a Tuesday morning. David arrived at 8:45 a.m. to find the hallway outside courtroom 3B packed with his neighbors, local reporters, and several people he didn't recognize in expensive suits. Word of the HOA embezzlement scandal had spread beyond Willowbrook Estates. Mrs. Patterson waved him over, her face flushed with excitement. "Channel 7 News wants to interview you about the corruption." "Not now, Mrs. Patterson." David's lawyer, James Williams, materialized at his elbow. "We need to talk before we go in there." Williams guided David to a quiet alcove, his expression grim. "I've got good news and catastrophic news. Which do you want first?" "Catastrophic, always." Karen's legal team filed a motion this morning claiming your pool was built on an illegal easement. They're arguing that your grandmother's 1987 property survey was fraudulent, and that the pool actually sits on community land that was improperly deeded to your family. David's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I have all the original documentation. They have a 1985 survey that shows different property lines, signed by the same surveyor who did your grandmother's work 2 years later." Williams pulled out a manila folder. "The implication is that someone paid him to falsify the 1987 survey to include an extra 15 feet of community property. And the good news? The county attorney filed embezzlement charges against Karen this morning. Turns out your investigation uncovered more than just the playground fund. She's been skimming HOA fees for 3 years. We're talking about nearly $6,000. The courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called for all parties in Martinez vs. Chen. David followed Williams inside. noting the unusually large gallery for what should have been a simple civil dispute. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits, her face a mask of controlled panic. Judge Margaret Holloway, a stern woman in her 60s known for her no-nonsense approach, called the court to order. This is a hearing on plaintiff's motion for emergency injunctive relief. Ms. Martinez claims that defendant's removal of a swimming pool has damaged community property and seeks both monetary damages and an order requiring reconstruction. Mr. Williams, your response? Williams stood. Your Honor, this is a frivolous lawsuit designed to distract from Ms. Martinez's recent indictment for embezzling HOA funds. The pool was entirely on my client's private property, as confirmed by multiple surveys over 30 years. Your Honor, interrupted Karen's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Bradford Ashworth, who David recognized from billboards around the city. We have new evidence that calls those surveys into question. Ashworth approached the bench with a thick folder. This is a 1985 survey conducted by Harold Zimmerman, the same surveyor who performed the 1987 survey for the defendant's grandmother. As you can see, the property lines are significantly different. Judge Holloway examined the documents, her frown deepening. Mr. Williams, have you seen this survey? No, Your Honor. It was not disclosed during discovery, which ended yesterday. The survey was recently discovered in county archives, Ashworth said smoothly. We're requesting an emergency hearing because every day the pool remains demolished causes ongoing damage to community property values. David leaned forward to whisper to Williams, but the judge's sharp voice cut through the courtroom. Mr. Chen, you look like you have something to say. Approach the bench. David's heart pounded as he walked forward. Your Honor, I'm a forensic accountant by training. I'd like to examine that survey. Objection? Ashworth said immediately. The defendant is not qualified to authenticate historical documents. I'll allow it, Judge Holloway said. Mr. Chen, what do you see? David studied the 1985 survey, his trained eye catching details that others might miss. The paper looked appropriately aged, the signatures authentic, but something felt off about the measurements and notations. Your Honor, this survey shows my grandmother's property is 0.67 acres. But her tax records from 1985 show 0.84 acres. The county has been taxing her for that extra land for 40 years. Either the county made a massive error that nobody caught, or this survey is fabricated. Ashworth's confident expression faltered slightly. Tax records can be inaccurate. Not for 40 years, David interrupted. And there's something else. The 1985 survey shows a mature oak tree in the disputed area. But that tree was planted in 1989 as part of the original community landscaping project. I have the HOA meeting minutes from when they approved the expense. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Order, Mr. Ashworth. Do you have a response to these discrepancies? Your Honor, we would need time to investigate these claims. Time you should have taken before filing this emergency motion, the judge said dryly. Mr. Williams, I assume you have the tax records and HOA minutes Mr. Chen referenced. We can have them here within an hour, Your Honor. Judge Holloway checked her watch. Court is in recess for 1 hour. When we return, I want to see those documents, and I want someone from the county assessor's office here to explain how they've been taxing land that allegedly doesn't belong to the Chen family. As the courtroom emptied for recess, David caught sight of Karen in heated conversation with her legal team. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing toward the gallery, where the man in the expensive suit from last night sat watching everything with cold calculation. Who is that guy? David asked Williams, as they headed toward the courthouse cafe. Robert Blackstone himself. He doesn't usually handle small civil cases, which makes me wonder what Karen has on him, or what he has on her. Over coffee, Williams made calls while David reviewed his grandmother's property documents. Everything was consistent with his claims, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. Karen's desperation seemed out of proportion to simple embezzlement charges, and the involvement of a high-powered attorney suggested stakes far beyond HOA politics. David Chen. He looked up to see a young woman with a press badge and a nervous expression. I'm Jessica Torres from Channel 7. Can I ask you a few questions about the HOA corruption scandal? Not right now, please. Just one question. Do you know anything about the Riverside Development Group's plans for Willowbrook Estates? David's blood went cold. What plans? Jessica glanced around nervously. I've been investigating land deals in your area. Riverside Development has been quietly buying up properties in your neighborhood for the past 2 years. They're planning a massive commercial development, but they need community land to make it work. Specifically, they need the area where your pool was located. That's impossible. The community land is protected by covenant, not if the HOA board unanimously agrees to sell it. And if Karen Martinez controls the HOA, Jessica left the implication hanging. David's mind raced. The mysterious legal backing, the desperate attempt to claim his property, the fabricated survey, it all made sense now. Karen wasn't just embezzling HOA funds. She was positioning herself to sell community property to developers, and his pool sat right in the middle of their plans. How much are we talking about? David asked. According to my sources, Riverside Development is prepared to pay $5 million for the community land and adjacent properties. Karen would get a substantial finder's fee. Williams appeared at David's elbow, holding a stack of documents. David, we need to get back. I've got the tax records, and he stopped, noticing Jessica. Who are you? After Jessica explained her investigation, Williams's expression grew grave. This changes everything. If Karen is conspiring with developers, the embezzlement charges are just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about conspiracy, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Back in the courtroom, County Assessor Maria Valdez testified that the Chen family had indeed been taxed on 0.84 acres since 1985, consistent with all official property records. The 1985 survey Ashworth had produced was either an error or a fabrication, but determining which would require forensic document analysis, Judge Holloway wasn't impressed. Mr. Ashworth, your emergency motion is based on a document that contradicts 40 years of tax records and contains a geographical impossibility. Unless you have additional evidence, Your Honor, Ashworth interrupted, we request a continuance to allow for proper document authentication. Denied. This case has all the hallmarks of a frivolous lawsuit designed to harass the defendant. The emergency injunction is denied, and I'm imposing sanctions against the plaintiff for filing a motion based on questionable evidence. Karen's face crumpled as the judge continued. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential document fraud. As the courtroom cleared, David watched Karen's legal team abandon her like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Robert Blackstone didn't even acknowledge her as he strode out of the courtroom, phone already pressed to his ear. Karen sat alone at the plaintiff's table, staring at her hands. For a moment, David almost felt sorry for her. Then he remembered the harassment, the threats, the stolen money from his neighbor's HOA fees. Karen, he said quietly, approaching her table, it's over. The development deal, the embezzlement, all of it. You need to come clean before this gets worse. She looked up at him with eyes full of desperation and something that Riverside Park at 11 p.m. was a different world from the cheerful daytime venue where families held birthday parties and teenagers played basketball. Shadows stretched long and dark between the old oak trees, and the vintage bandstand, where Karen had asked to meet, looked like something from a noir film under the pale streetlights. David arrived 10 minutes early, his nerves on edge. He'd considered bringing Williams or even calling the police, but Karen's desperation in the courtroom had seemed genuine. If she was finally ready to tell the truth, he needed to hear it without the filter of lawyers and legal proceedings. The park was eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. David positioned himself where he could see all approaches to the bandstand, his phone ready to dial 911 if things went sideways. He'd spent the afternoon researching Riverside Development Group, and what he'd found had turned his stomach. They were notorious for using intimidation, bribery, and legal manipulation to acquire properties for their projects. Several whistleblowers, who'd tried to expose their methods, had faced harassment, lawsuits, and worse. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind him. David spun around to see Karen emerging from the shadows, but she looked nothing like the polished HOA president who'd terrorized the neighborhood for years. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who hadn't slept in days. You came, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I said I would now talk. Karen glanced around nervously, then sat heavily on one of the bandstand's wooden benches. I never meant for it to go this far. David, you have to believe that. Start from the beginning. How did Riverside Development get their hooks into you? 3 years ago, my husband lost his job. The accounting firm downsized, and Mark couldn't find work for months. We were drowning in debt, mortgage, credit, cards, my mother's medical bills. Karen's voice cracked with emotion. I started skimming small amounts from the HOA account just to keep us afloat. Nothing major, maybe $100 here and there. $60,000 isn't small amounts. Karen, it escalated. Every time I took money, I told myself it was the last time. Then Robert Blackstone showed up at my door 18 months ago. He knew about the missing funds. Said he could make my problems disappear if I helped him acquire certain properties in Willowbrook Estates. David felt a chill run down his spine. My property, not just yours. The whole eastern section of the neighborhood, including the community. Land Riverside Development wants to build a shopping complex, but they need continuous acreage to make it profitable. Your property is the keystone that makes the entire project possible. Because of the pool area. Karen nodded miserably. The community land extends further into your backyard than anyone realizes. When your grandmother had that pool built in 1995, she didn't know she was building on community property. The HOA never enforced the boundary because she stopped looking physically ill. Because what? Because your grandmother was paying them not to. $25,000 cash to the board members at the time. I found the records hidden in old HOA files. The payment was disguised as a landscaping contribution, but it was really a bribe to let her keep the pool on community land. David's world tilted. His beloved grandmother, the woman who'd taught him about integrity and honesty, had been corrupt. You're lying. I wish I was. Karen pulled a manila envelope from her jacket. It's all here. The payment records, the original survey that shows the actual property lines, meeting minutes where the board agreed to overlook the encroachment. Your grandmother bought her way out of a lawsuit and kept the pool by paying off corrupt officials. David's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The documents looked authentic bank records showing cash withdrawals from his grandmother's account, handwritten receipts, even a letter in her distinctive handwriting acknowledging the arrangement. The evidence was damning and undeniable. This doesn't make sense, David said, his voice hollow. If the pool was on community property, why didn't you just have it removed legally? Why all the drama with fake surveys and lawsuits? Because Blackstone wanted more than just the pool area. He wanted your entire property, and he needed a legal pretext to challenge your ownership. The plan was to prove the pool was community property, then argue that your grandmother's entire property transfer was fraudulent because it included land she didn't own. Son of a bitch was trying to steal my house. Worse than that, once they established a pattern of fraudulent property transfers, they planned to challenge multiple properties in the neighborhood, create enough legal chaos that homeowners would be forced to sell cheap rather than fight expensive court battles. David sank onto the bench beside Karen, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. How many people were involved? More than you want to know. City planning officials, county supervisors, even some judges. Riverside Development has been planning this for 5 years. They've already bought out 6 families in the neighborhood through shell companies. Yours was supposed to be the final piece was supposed to be. Karen's laugh was bitter. You demolished the pool. Without physical evidence of the encroachment, their case falls apart. And now that the embezzlement charges are public, I'm useless to them. Actually, I'm worse than useless. I'm a liability. What do you mean? Before Karen could answer, headlights swept across the park as a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Karen's face went white with terror. Oh God, they followed me. David, you need to run. Now who followed you? Blackstone's people. They've been watching me since the hearing. They know I'm talking to you. Karen grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. There's something else. Something I haven't told you. The reason they're so desperate to get this land? 2 men in dark clothing got out of the SUV and began walking toward the bandstand. They moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to violence. Karen, we need to go. Both of us. No, listen to me. Karen's voice was urgent, desperate. It's not just about the shopping complex. Riverside Development is a front company. The real client is a waste management corporation that wants to build a hazardous waste storage facility. They've been looking for a site that's close to the interstate but far from wealthy neighborhoods. Willowbrook Estates is perfect because it's middle-class people with enough money to buy their way out, but not enough to fight a prolonged legal battle. David's blood turned to ice. Hazardous waste. What kind of hazardous waste? Industrial, chemicals, medical waste, low-level radioactive materials. The kind of stuff that makes property uninhabitable for decades. They're planning to buy out the entire neighborhood over the next 5 years, relocate everyone, then build their facility on the ruins. The 2 men were 50 yards away and closing fast. David grabbed Karen's hand and pulled her toward the other side of the bandstand, but she resisted. I'm not running anymore, David. I'm tired of being their puppet. She pressed a flash drive into his palm. Everything's on here. Bank records, communications with Blackstone, the real development plans, even recordings of phone calls where they discussed eliminating problems. Eliminating problems? 3 people have died in the past 2 years. A county supervisor who opposed the zoning changes, an environmental activist who was investigating the waste management company, and a reporter who got too close to the truth. All ruled accidents or suicides, but I know better. The men were 20 yards away now. David could see their faces in the streetlight, hard, professional, the kind of people who solved problems permanently. Karen Martinez, one of them called out. Mr. Blackstone wants to speak with you. Run, Karen whispered to David. Take the flash drive to the FBI. Agent Sarah Vance in the Los Angeles field office. She's been investigating Riverside Development for months. Tell her the Willowbrook project is active. I'm not leaving you here. You have to put this is my mess, and I'm the only one who can fix it. Karen stood up, squaring her shoulders with newfound courage. Besides, they won't hurt me here. Too public, too risky. David wanted to argue, but the men were almost on them. He pocketed the flash drive and slipped away into the shadows, using the park's landscape to mask his retreat. From behind a cluster of trees, he watched Karen walk calmly toward the 2 men. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. I assume Mr. Blackstone is waiting in the car. He is. Let's go, of course. But first, I should mention that I've already given copies of all my files to the authorities, and to Channel 7 News, and to the Los Angeles Times. Oh, and I sent a very detailed confession to the FBI about an hour ago. The men exchanged glances. You're lying. Karen smiled for the first time David had seen all evening. Check your phones. Boys, I think you'll find that Riverside Development's corporate accounts were frozen about 20 minutes ago. Federal agents are probably raiding your offices right about now. One of the men pulled out his phone and made a call. David couldn't hear the conversation, but the man's expression told him everything he needed to know. Karen wasn't bluffing. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," the second man said, but his tone had changed from threatening to uncertain. "Actually, I don't think I do." Karen pulled out her own phone and pressed a button. Suddenly, the park was. 6 months later, David stood in his backyard surveying the new landscape where his pool used to be. Fresh sod had transformed the excavation site into a perfect green lawn. But the real transformation had happened to the neighborhood itself. Federal investigations had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of county government, leading to 17 indictments and the complete restructuring of local zoning boards. The morning sun caught the surface of his coffee as he read the latest newspaper coverage of the Riverside Development scandal. Robert Blackstone had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, bribery, and racketeering. 3 county supervisors had resigned in disgrace. The waste management company behind the scheme had been fined $200 million and banned from operating in California. Mr. Chen. David turned to see a young woman approaching across his yard. She looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place her until she spoke again. "I'm Jennifer Martinez, Karen's daughter." David's stomach tightened. He hadn't seen or heard from Karen since that night in the park 6 months ago. She'd been sentenced to 3 years in minimum security prison for embezzlement, but her cooperation with federal investigators had saved her from the much harsher sentences handed down to Blackstone and his associates. "Jennifer, I'm sorry about your mother." "Don't be." Jennifer's voice was steady, matter of fact. She did what she had to do to clean up her own mess. "I'm actually here because of something else." She handed him a thick manila envelope. "Mom asked me to give this to you when I turned 18 last week. She said you'd understand what it means." David opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were more documents, property records, bank statements, and a handwritten letter in his grandmother's familiar script. But these weren't the forgeries Karen had shown him in the park. These were older, more personal. The letter was dated December 15, 1995, and addressed to the future owner of this property. "To whoever inherits this house, I am writing this letter to explain decisions I made that may seem questionable to future generations. When I had the swimming pool built in 1995, I knew it extended onto community property. The HOA board at the time was corrupt and had been embezzling funds for years. I had evidence of their theft, but rather than destroy them and create chaos in the neighborhood, I chose a different path. I paid them $25,000, not as a bribe, but as restitution for the money they had stolen from residents over the years. In exchange, they agreed to resign from the board and allow honest elections. The pool encroachment was simply overlooked as part of this arrangement. The money I paid was my way of buying peace for the neighborhood and ensuring that future boards would be run by honest people. I hope whoever reads this will understand that sometimes we must make imperfect choices to protect the people we care about. I have left additional documentation in Safety Deposit Box 347 at First National Bank, along with funds to cover any future legal issues this arrangement might cause. With love and hope for understanding, Eleanor Chen. David's hands shook as he finished reading. His grandmother hadn't been corrupt. She'd been protecting the neighborhood from corruption. The bank records Karen had shown him were real, but the context had been completely wrong. "There's more," Jennifer said quietly. "Mom found these documents when she was researching your property for Blackstone. She never told him about the letter or the safety deposit box. She kept them because she said they proved your grandmother was a better person than any of them deserved." David looked up at Jennifer, seeing Karen's features but none of her mother's desperation or fear. "Why didn't she tell me this at the park?" "Because she was afraid you wouldn't believe her after everything else she'd lied about, and because she needed you to hate her enough to take down Blackstone. If you'd known the truth about your grandmother, you might have been too shocked to act. She manipulated me. Again. She saved you, and the entire neighborhood." Jennifer's voice carried a conviction that reminded David of Karen's final moments of courage in the park. "Do you know what would have happened if that waste facility had been built? 47 families would have lost their homes. The groundwater would have been contaminated for generations. Children would have gotten sick." David walked over to the area where his pool used to be, Jennifer following behind him. The truth was more complex than he'd ever imagined. His grandmother had made a morally ambiguous choice that protected people. Karen had made terrible choices that led to worse ones, but ultimately found the courage to do the right thing. Even Blackstone, in his twisted way, had believed he was providing a necessary service by finding locations for hazardous waste that had to go somewhere. "What happens now?" David asked. "Mom gets out in 18 months with good behavior. She's been taking accounting classes in prison and working with federal investigators to trace money laundering schemes. She says when she gets out, she wants to use her skills to help people instead of stealing from them." David nodded, looking across his yard toward the Martinez house. It had been empty since Karen's arrest. a for sale sign planted in the perfectly manicured lawn like a small gravestone. "The house sold last week," Jennifer said, following his gaze. "The new owners seem nice. They have 2 young kids and a golden retriever. Mom would have liked that. What about you? Where are you living?" "With my aunt in Phoenix. I'm starting college in the Arizona state, majoring in journalism. I want to investigate corporate corruption like my mom should have done instead of participating in it." David smiled for the first time in the conversation. "That sounds like a worthy goal." Jennifer reached into her backpack and pulled out one more document. "This is the deed to the safety deposit box. Mom said the bank manager is expecting you." 2 hours later, David sat in the sterile privacy room at First National Bank, staring at the contents of his grandmother's safety deposit box. Along with the original property surveys and legal documents was a cashier's check for $50,000, made out to bearer and dated 3 months before his grandmother's death. A sticky note in her handwriting read, "For pool removal and property restoration, if necessary." She had known, somehow, Eleanor Chen had anticipated that her compromise with the corrupt HOA board would eventually cause problems for her family. She'd left money and legal documentation to fix whatever issues arose. But she'd died before she could explain the situation to David directly. The bank manager, an elderly man who remembered Eleanor, provided one final piece of the puzzle. "Your grandmother came in here every few months to update her safety deposit box," he said. "She was always worried about something happening to the neighborhood. Some outside force that might try to take advantage of good people. She used to say that honest people have to be smarter than dishonest ones, because dishonest people don't follow the rules." That evening, David hosted a neighborhood barbecue in his backyard. It was something his grandmother used to do every summer, but the tradition had died with her. Now, with the corruption exposed and the threat eliminated, it seemed like the right time to bring the community together. Mrs. Patterson brought her famous potato salad. The new family in Karen's old house introduced themselves as the Johnsons, and immediately fit in with the established residents. Even Jessica Torres from Channel 7 stopped by to follow up on her investigation and ended up staying for dinner. As the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, David found himself standing in the exact spot where his pool used to be, surrounded by neighbors who were laughing and sharing stories. The space that had once been a symbol of division and conflict had become the heart of a community gathering. "You did good, David," Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at his elbow with a plate of dessert. "Your grandmother would be proud." David thought about that as he watched children playing in the yard where corruption and conspiracy had once threatened to destroy everything. His grandmother had made an imperfect choice to protect imperfect people in an imperfect world. Karen had made terrible choices but found the courage to make them right. He had made the choice to tear down something beautiful to uncover something ugly, but in the end, that ugly truth had protected something even more beautiful, the community itself. The pool was gone, but the foundation remained solid. Sometimes, that's all you can ask for. Late that night, after the last neighbor had gone home and the dishes were cleaned up, David sat on his back porch with a beer and his laptop. He'd been working on something for weeks, a letter to the parole board supporting Karen's early release. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to support the early parole of Karen Martinez. While I cannot excuse the choices that led to her incarceration, I have seen firsthand the courage she demonstrated in exposing a conspiracy that threatened our entire community. People make mistakes. The measure of their character is not whether they fall, but whether they find the strength to get back up and make things right. Karen Martinez nearly destroyed our neighborhood through her poor choices, but she ultimately saved it through her good ones. She deserves a second chance to build something better. Sincerely, David Chen." As he hit send, David realized that the real victory wasn't defeating Karen, or exposing Blackstone, or even learning the truth about his grandmother. The real victory was